Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video we're going to explain how you can add code to reports in SQL Server reporting services. So the video is all about how you can write custom functions in a report in your report project. We'll start the video with an explanation of why you might want to do that in the first place, and then show you where you can go to write the code and give you a quick example of a very basic visual basic function that you could write. Once we've written the function, we'll explain how you can go about using that in expressions in the report, before we move on and talk about a more sophisticated way to write your function code using a Visual Basic class library. Just in case you haven't got it, I'm going to give you a quick explanation of where you can go to get the Visual Studio Express edition, just in case you need that in order to write your function code. And then we'll have a very brief introduction to writing VB code, including things like declaring parameters, using variables, and as well using a select case statement. The last little part of the video is going to explain how you can make your code available to future reports by saving your code in a template and then basing future reports on that template. So let's get started. In reporting services, it's possible to write some fairly elaborate expressions to calculate new values within your reports. In this example, I've written a fairly complex expression to calculate a format for dates. If I show you the expression itself by right-clicking on this text box and choosing expression, it's a fairly long and complex thing. Then the result of this, if I run the report or preview the report, is that I get a nicely formatted date for my report page header. Now you might notice as well that that same format appears in a couple of other parts of the report as well. So I've got the director's date of birth formatted in the same way, and also the film release dates formatted in the same way. And in order to accomplish that, what I've had to do is repeat the same expression in other parts of my report's design. Now this is where things get a little bit awkward. I've had to write out this expression 3 times. Well, I cheated, really. I copied and pasted and just tweaked a few things. But nevertheless, it was quite irritating to have to do that copy and paste. And also, if I decide that I want to change the way my date format works, I've now got several different places that I need to change that. So one way to avoid falling into this situation in reporting services is to add custom functions to a report in the report's code page. If I switch to this other report, it's essentially exactly the same thing, except that the expressions to calculate the date formats are much simpler. If I show you the expression, what I'm doing is calling on a custom function that I've written called longDateFormat, and I can pass into that function a single date, and that will return the nicely formatted version of that date. And I've called on that function in several other parts of the report as well. So I'm calling on it here to format the director's date of birth, and here to format the film's release date. The end result for the end user is exactly the same. They see the nicely formatted version of the date, but for you as a developer, it's much simpler to keep this code up to date. So this video is all about how you can write those sorts of functions and add them to your reports. To demonstrate how to add code to a report, let's start by adding a brand new blank one to our project. So from the Solution Explorer, I'm going to right-click the Reports folder and choose Add New Item. I'm going to base this on a blank report template, and I'm going to call mine number 56, Adding Code. Once the report's been created, to add some code to it, we need to view the Report Properties window. So the easiest way to do that is to right-click somewhere away from the actual report page itself and choose to view the report properties. What you'll find on there is a Code tab on the left-hand side of the dialog box, and then a great big white blank text box where you can write out all of your custom code. It's as simple as that. Now the language you must use to write custom code in a report is Visual Basic. You don't get any choice in that, it must be Visual Basic. So of course you'll need to know your Visual Basic syntax reasonably well in order to write Visual Basic functions. I'm going to start by showing you an incredibly simple example. All this function is going to do is return the company name of YSL Training. So it's going to return a string of text that says YSL Training. That's all it's going to do. This is purely to demonstrate the absolute basics of writing function code. What we'll do in a moment is show you a much better way to write your functions so that you get a lot more help. Because if you start writing your code in this window, it literally is just a plain text editor. You don't get any help whatsoever. I know that in Visual Basic rather than VBA, in VB you start all functions with the word function. I'm going to call mine company name. So your function must have a unique descriptive name. It's not going to have any parameters. I'm not going to pass any information into this function, but I do need to open and close a set of parentheses. Following that, what I need to do is say what kind of data the function returns. So I can do that by saying as string. I'm going to give myself a couple of blank lines at that point, and then I'm going to write the words end function. So every function that begins has to end at some point. And then in between these two lines, I'm going to write out a statement which says what value I want my function to return. So to do that, I'm going to say return, and then it's a literal string of text. I'm going to open some double quotes, say why is owl training, close the double quotes, and that's essentially my entire function written. If I click OK, that function is now available to this report. To demonstrate how to use a function that you've written in your report, let's insert a basic text box. And in there, let's insert an expression. So if I right-click into the text box and choose expression, this is where I can now call my function. Now again, sadly you don't get any help in calling the functions that you've written yourself. You have to remember what you've called them. And to begin with, anytime you call a function that you've written, you must start it with a reference to the code namespace. So if I say equals code, followed by a full stop, then I can write out the name of the function that I've written, which I remembered I called my company name. I didn't provide any parameters to my function, so I don't need to pass any information into it. So I can either leave the company name function written like so, or I can optionally open and close the parentheses, which is standard VB syntax. It doesn't really matter for this simple example whether you do or you don't do that. It looks as though there's an error going to occur here. The squiggly red underline indicates that this function name hasn't been recognised, but you just have to trust that this will actually work. When I click OK and then preview the report, what we should see is that eventually we return the phrase that we've told our function to return, why is owl training? So not a particularly sophisticated example, but it's enough to demonstrate hopefully the absolute basics of adding code to a report. If I want to add more than one custom function to a report, it's as simple as heading straight back to the Report Properties dialog box, going to the Code tab, and then creating a new function immediately after the first one. So I could say function, and then maybe create the function that generates my nice elaborate date format. But if I'm writing a function much more complicated than the one we've seen so far, then it's going to be quite difficult to write out all the code without knowing VB syntax, or at least without getting a bit of help with our syntax. So for the next example, we're not going to write our function in the code page directly. What we're going to do is generate a VB class library, write all of our code in there, and then eventually copy and paste it back to the Report Properties dialog box. So I'm just going to cancel from this dialog box for the moment and show you how you can go about creating a class library for writing your code. One place that you could choose to create your class library for writing your VB code is in the same solution that your report project belongs to. So from the Solution Explorer, what you could do, scroll to the top, find your solution, Movies project in this case, which contains currently one project. Then I could right-click on that solution and choose to add a new project. If you can't see the solution already at the top of the list in your Solution Explorer, you may well need to change a setting in the Tools menu in Visual Studio. If I head to the Tools menu and choose Options, then there is a setting for Projects and Solutions, and there's a checkbox for Always Show Solution. So if you make sure that that box is checked if you can't see your solution currently, then I can click OK, then you can right-click on your solution, choose Add, New Project, and then you can choose what type of project you want to create. Just for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to create my class library in the same solution as my report project, because eventually our class library will be deleted anyway. We're not going to include it as part of our solution. It's purely a simple place to write some code. So to avoid cluttering up my solution, I'm going to actually create a separate class library and a completely separate Visual Studio solution. So to do that, I'm going to open up Visual Studio itself first of all. I can do that either from the Start menu, or I've got a quick shortcut that I'm going to double click on here. And I'm opening up Visual Studio 2010, which is the same edition that I'm running for my report project. So this Movies project is currently running in SQL Server Data Tools, which is running in Visual Studio 2010. Now I don't have to use the exact same version of Visual Studio. It really genuinely doesn't matter. For writing a simple class library, I could use any earlier or later version of Visual Studio to write this code. The important thing that I must be able to do though is head to the File menu, choose New Project, and I must be able to select from Visual Basic templates. Now it may well be the case that if you've only installed Visual Studio through the virtue of having installed reporting services, you may well only have access to the business intelligence set of templates, so you might only have Visual Studio Shell installed. If that's the case, if you can't see any of these other options here in the templates list, you'll need to download another edition of Visual Studio. So I'm just going to show you a quick little way to get access to another version of Visual Studio. The cheapest and probably the easiest way to get hold of a full version of Visual Studio is to download Visual Studio Express from the Microsoft website. So just to very quickly lead you through that process, I've quickly googled for Visual Studio Express, and the top hit in the search is Visual Studio Express. If I follow that link, I'll end up at this webpage. So currently the latest version that's available for download is Visual Studio 2013. You can scroll through the list of different versions available, and I suspect that probably the one you want to go for is Express 2013 for Windows Desktop, which comes along with a set of programming languages including Visual Basic, which is actually the one that you want. Now you're more than welcome to go for Visual Studio 2013. I haven't actually used that one version myself. The latest version I've used is Visual Studio 2012. But it's more than acceptable to download this version and create your class libraries in that version. If you'd prefer to keep things a little bit more consistent, so currently we're using Visual Studio 2010 in this particular video, you can scroll all the way down towards the bottom of the page and find the older versions of Visual Studio available for download there as well. So you can still go for Visual Studio 2010 Express. If you do go with this option, you'll need to be a little bit more careful about which choice of version you make for downloading. The newer versions of Visual Studio come along with a family of programming languages in one version. In 2010, you have to choose which programming language you want. And for this particular set of examples, you'll want to make sure you go for the Visual Basic version. There's nothing to stop you from going away and downloading the other ones as well later on and adding those templates to your Visual Studio. That's more than acceptable. But for this example, make sure you go with the Visual Basic version. I'll leave all the downloading and installing stuff to you. What we'll do now is we'll switch back to our Visual Studio window and just talk to you about how you can go about creating this class library. So hopefully you've downloaded and successfully installed Visual Studio at this point, so you should now be able to open it up, head to the File menu, choose New, try that again, choose New Project, and then from the list of installed templates, head to the Visual Basic category and choose the Class Library project. Now it genuinely doesn't matter what you call this because we're going to discard it later on anyway. We're not going to ever actually keep this permanently. So I just want to make sure that I save this in a particularly sensible location. So I'm going to go to the Browse button and choose to save my project on my desktop and then click OK to generate my new class library. So you should end up with a fairly basic code page opener, a class1.vb page. It has public class class1, which you can pretty much ignore. All we're going to do now is write out our new function in between public class and end class, and we'll see how much extra help we actually get. Just as with our previous example, I'm going to start by writing the word function. So I start with the letter F, of course, and then I find that I don't actually need to type out the word function after all. I can simply select it from my IntelliSense list. I'll press the down arrow key to select it, and then type in a space to type in that word followed by the space. So I've already saved myself loads of time. The next thing I need to do is say what I want to call my function. I'm going to call mine long date format, so it's going to have a unique, sensible, descriptive name. Then I can open up some parentheses, and I'll immediately get some more help about what to do with naming parameters. I'm not actually going to select any of the keywords here. I'm just going to go straight to naming the parameter that I like to pass a value into. So I'm going to call my parameter anyDate. So that just names the value that I pass into this function. It's the date that will become formatted. If I type in a space, I'm prompted to put in the keyword as. So I've got to specify the data type for my parameter. So I can select that from the list with the down arrow key and press space. And then the data type that I'm going to use is date. And again, I'll get help with that, although it's probably just as convenient to type the rest of that word in manually. If I close the parentheses at that point, type in another space, I'm prompted for one or two words. I'm going to use the word as here, followed by another space. And then I'm going to say that this function is going to return a string. So I can type in the three letters str. The word string gets highlighted in my list. If I press enter at this point, it'll type in the rest of that word and the word's end function for me. So I've already saved myself loads of time. Now I just want to go reasonably quickly through generating the rest of the function code. And one of the key ideas in the way my function works is adding the suffix to the end of the number of the day of the month. So when it's the first, I need the letters ST, the second ND, and so on and so on. So I'm going to calculate which suffix to use using a variable. And in VB, I declare variables using the dim keyword. I need to give my variable a sensible name. I'm going to call mine suffix. And then I need to say what data type it will be. I'm going to say as string. I get some squiggly green underlines indicating various errors. So the one under the word suffix means that I've declared a variable, but I haven't used it yet. I always think, well, give me a chance, I've only just declared it. I've also got one under the end function, which is telling me that I don't return a value on all my code paths just yet. So we'll resolve those situations as we go along. Now, to determine which suffix to use, I'm going to use a select case statement in VB. So I'm going to start by writing the word select, followed by case, although I can in fact just insert that using the IntelliSense somewhere. I'm actually just going to type mine out in this case. So select case. The case that I want to select, the value that I'm trying to determine, is going to be the day of the month of the date that I've passed in. So I'm going to calculate that using a function called day, which you'll see again appears in my IntelliSense list. I can open some parentheses there, and the date that I want to calculate that from is called any date. So if I hit enter at this point, I'll get my end select added for me, so I don't forget to do that. And then I just need to write out the various cases that I'm testing for. So the first case is going to be case 1 or 21 or 31. When that's true, I want to set the suffix variable to be equal to the letters st. On the next line, I'm going to say case 2 or 22. And if that's true, I'm going to say suffix equals nd. Next line, case 3 or 23. If that's true, suffix will become equal to rd. And finally, I need to enter my case else, which I can actually select from my IntelliSense here. Case else, suffix equals th. So that's the main part of the function created, or the most awkward part created. All we've got to do now is concatenate the various other parts of the date format together and return the final value. So after my select case statement, I'm going to say return and then concatenate the complete string. So I'm going to use the format function, which again is built into Visual Basic and appears in my IntelliSense list. There's two arguments I need to provide. The first is what I'm trying to format, so that's going to be my argument or my parameter any date. Then I need to say how I'd like that to be formatted, so I'm going to put in a style as a string. So for me, I'm going to say I'm going to put in 4 Ds, followed by a space and another single D. So that'll give me sort of, for example, Thursday 2, if it was Thursday the 2nd of some month. What I then want to do is concatenate on my suffix. So I'm going to use the ampersand there to concatenate the suffix, and then another ampersand, and I'm going to call the format function again. I'm going to say format any date, but this time the format code is going to be a space followed by 4 M's, or 5 as I've typed in there, followed by another space and 4 Y's. Close the double quotes, close the parentheses, and that's the entire function written. You'll see now the green squiggly underlines gets cleared, and because I'm returning a value to this function. So that's the basics of writing code in a class library. The next step is to get this code back to our report project. Getting code back from our class library into our report project is just as simple as copying and pasting. So the important thing is to make sure you get all of the code that you actually want to copy. So everything from function to end function. Select that text and then you can either right click and copy or press Ctrl and C, any of the standard ways you know how to copy. Then I'm going to switch back to my report project and we're back in the same blank report. I'm going to right click in the background area to view the report properties, head to the code tab, and then make sure I've got a blank line or two after end function, and then simply paste in my code by pressing Ctrl and V. And this will show you one of the most frustrating things about the whole process. When you actually paste your code in, it retains all the formatting of the code as you've written it in your class library, which is really frustrating. Why can't it do that in the first place? Anyway, when I click OK, this is just a very, very temporary thing. If I switch back to the Report Properties dialog box again and go to the code page, you'll find that it's lost all the fancy formatting that it previously had. But the important thing is we know that this function will is syntactically correct because the class library we were writing it in helps us out with all the spelling and syntax and so on. So I've got a function now called longDateFormat. All I would need to do is test it out somewhere in my report. So the simplest way to do that is to insert a text box and then add an expression to the text box which calls on that function. So I can right click, choose expression, and I'm going to say, remember again, code dot longDateFormat, which was the name of my function. I've got to pass a value into this function now, so I've got to pass an argument into its parameter, and the value I'm going to pass in is going to be the execution time. So I'm going to go to the built-in fields category and double click the execution time value. And I close the parentheses at that point and then hit OK and preview my report, and I'll hopefully see that my function now works. And I can use that function in any other part of this report. So if I build a data source and a data set, including date time fields, I could use my function to format those in a neat way. So there's the basics of writing function code in reporting services reports. One small downside to adding code to a single report is that, of course, that code and those functions will only be available to the reports you're using. So one fairly simplistic way to make your code available to future reports is to create a report template. Now, we've covered this process in a lot more detail in the previous video in the series, so just a very quick overview of how you go about generating a report template. I'm going to delete any items out of this report that I don't want to include in my template, so that includes those two text boxes. So essentially, all this report contains is the code that I've added to the code page of the report properties window. If I hit OK, I'm going to close and save this report, and then I simply need to make sure that I copy that report to the relevant location to turn it into a template. So I've got a Windows Explorer window here pointing towards my movies project. So if I head into that project and then head into the subfolder in there, I need to find the report itself, which is number 56, adding code, and there it is. And I simply need to copy that file and put it in the appropriate location. So I'm going to go to the C drive. Then I'm going to head to my Program Files folder. Then I'm going to find the folder for Visual Studio 10, which is 2010. In there I'm going to go to the Common 7 folder, IDE, then the Private Assemblies folder in there, the Project Items folder in there, Report Project, and finally I can paste in the file that I've just copied. I'm going to change its name slightly as well. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to take the number away, I'm just going to call it Report with Code. You can see I've already added a WiseOwl template to this from the previous video. So if you're interested in more detail about this, a bit more explanation, there's a previous video, as I say, about how templates work. But now that I've pasted that file there, if I go back to my Movies project, head back to my Solution Explorer, and I choose to create a new report, so I can add a new item, I'll find that my Report with Code item is available. And if I add a new item based on that template, I can find, in fact it's easiest to show you, that this report comes along with all the code that we've previously written. So that's the simplest way by far to distribute code that you've written in a single report. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.